Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The morphine isn't working anymore. Dr. Peterson increased the dosage yesterday, but the pain has teeth now, gnawing through pharmaceutical barriers like they're tissue paper. 6 weeks, he told me, maybe 4. The tumour in my pancreas has its own agenda, and it's not interested in negotiations. My name is John Miller. Most people would recognize me from the history books. Apollo 14, Apollo 16, decorated astronaut, American hero. What they don't know is that there was a third mission, one that exists only in buried files and the deteriorating memories of 2 old men. Well, 1 old man now. Bobby King ate his service pistol 3 years ago, leaving me as the sole keeper of a secret that could shatter everything humanity believes about our place in the universe. Apollo 18, December 1972. The mission that never happened, except it did happen. And what we found up there, in the permanent darkness of the moon's far side, is why we never went back. Why we'll never go back. Why we shouldn't go back. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning, before the nightmares, before the sleepless decades, before I understood that some doors should never be opened. The call came on October 19th, 1972. I remember the date because it was Linda's birthday, and I was in the kitchen attempting to make her favourite chocolate cake when the phone rang. The voice belonged to Dr. Harrison Webb, NASA's Deputy Director of Lunar Operations, and his words carried the weight of national security. "John, I need you at Johnson Space Center tomorrow morning, early. There's a matter of extreme sensitivity that requires your immediate attention." In our business, extreme sensitivity meant one of 2 things. Either the Soviets had done something that scared the hell out of Washington, or we'd discovered something that scared the hell out of everyone. As it turned out, it was the latter. The briefing took place in sub-level C of Building 30, behind security doors that required clearances I didn't know existed. The room itself was a sterile white box with no windows, no decorations, nothing but a conference table, 6 chairs, and a sense of dread so thick you could taste it. Waiting for me were Webb and 2 men who introduced themselves only as Smith and Jones, names so obviously fabricated they might as well have worn signs reading CIA. Also present were my future crewmates, Captain Robert King, a 41-year-old Apollo veteran with ice water in his veins, and David Hall, our flight engineer, whose brilliant mind could rebuild a spacecraft from spare parts and determination. Webb began without preamble. "Gentlemen, what I'm about to show you is classified at the highest levels of government. The President himself has seen these materials. What you learn in this room today will never leave this room. Ever." He spread a collection of photographs across the table, each one bearing classification stamps that made my security clearance look like a library card. They were orbital shots of the moon's far side, specifically focusing on a massive impact crater designated Ptolemaeus in the scientific literature. At first glance, they looked routine, standard geological survey work, the kind of thing we'd been doing since Apollo 11, but Webb directed our attention to specific grid coordinates, and suddenly nothing looked routine anymore. These images were captured during Apollo 16's extended orbital photography mission, Webb explained, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Look carefully at sectors 7G through 12M. I leaned closer, studying the grainy black and white photographs. There, scattered across the crater floor like monuments in an in a forgotten cemetery, were structures, not natural rock formations or meteoric debris, but deliberate constructions with clean lines, sharp angles, and geometric precision that spoke of intelligence and purpose. They looked like buildings, or perhaps the exposed tops of much larger complexes buried beneath the lunar surface. Unusual rock formations? King suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. Smith, or maybe it was Jones, shook his head slowly. The formations display too much regularity, too much intention, and there are other anomalies. Webb produced a second set of photographs, these taken with specialized high-resolution equipment that revealed details no human eye was meant to see. The structures were clearer now, their alien architecture undeniable. Doorways that were too tall and too narrow for human proportions. Passages that curved in directions that made my eyes water to follow, and connecting them all, a network of pathways worn smooth into the lunar regolith by the passage of something. Someone built these, I whispered. Something, the other agent corrected, his tone suggesting that the distinction was important, and recent seismic data suggests they may not be abandoned. That's when Webb activated the tape recorder. The speakers crackled with static, then cleared to reveal a sound that would haunt every sleeping moment for the rest of my life. It was breathing. Deep, rhythmic respirations that echoed with the hollow quality of something vast and empty. But there was pattern to it, structure, as if multiple sources were coordinating their exhalations in perfect harmony. This audio was recorded during Apollo 16's orbit of the far side, Webb explained, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the volume controls. The transmissions originate from Crater Ptolemaeus, specifically from the subsurface areas beneath these structures. Our linguists believe the patterns suggest organized communication, possibly even language. David leaned forward, his engineering mind already analyzing the implications. What's the mission profile? Jones opened a briefing folder that bore more classification stamps than the Manhattan Project files. Apollo 18 will launch under deep cover in 6 weeks. Official story is extended orbital mechanics testing. Your real destination is Crater Ptolemaeus. Primary objective, reconnaissance and assessment. Secondary objective, sample collection and documentation. Tertiary objective. He paused, exchanging glances with his partner. Threat evaluation. We need to know if whatever's down there poses a danger to Earth, because recent data suggests it's becoming more active. The next 6 weeks passed like a fever dream. Intensive training sessions conducted in windowless rooms, emergency protocols for scenarios that had no names, communication procedures designed for extended periods without contact with mission control. We practiced landing approaches to Crater Ptolemaeus until we could navigate its treacherous terrain blindfolded, studying every photograph until the alien landscape became as familiar as our own neighborhoods. But nothing, no amount of training or preparation could have readied us for the reality of what we found. Launch came at 3:47 a.m. on December 7th, 1972, Pearl Harbor Day, though the irony wouldn't become apparent until much later. No media coverage, no crowds of spectators, no families waving goodbye from the viewing stands. Just 3 men strapped to a Saturn V rocket, rising into the Florida darkness under a blanket of secrecy so complete that even our wives believed we were conducting routine orbital tests. Linda kissed me goodbye at the crew quarters, her eyes bright with the same pride and excitement she'd shown from my previous missions. She had no idea I might never return. None of our families did. That knowledge sat in my chest like a tumor as we climbed through Earth's atmosphere, leaving behind everything we'd ever loved for a destination that might prove to be our tomb. The journey to lunar orbit took 3.5 days, and with each passing hour, the radio interference grew worse. Voices from mission control became increasingly garbled, mixing with static that seemed to pulse in the same rhythm as those breathing sounds from the briefing room recordings. By the time we achieved lunar orbit, Communication with Earth was reduced to brief, crackling exchanges during our passes over the near side. On the far side, we were completely alone. Our first orbital pass over Crater Ptolemaeus revealed changes that sent ice water through my veins. The structures we'd studied in the photographs had grown. What had been scattered geometric formations were now extensive networks of dark towers and connecting complexes, all carved directly into the lunar bedrock, with precision that would have challenged our most advanced construction techniques. "Sweet Mother of God," David breathed, pressing his face against the command module's small window. "There must be hundreds of structures down there, maybe thousands." King was studying the formations through our high-powered binoculars, his weathered face growing pale. "Those passages extend deep underground. I'm seeing multiple levels, like a vast subterranean city. And look at the excavation sites. Some of this construction is recent." Fresh dig sites surrounded the main complex, new tunnels connecting previously isolated sections, piles of excavated material arranged with mathematical precision. And throughout the crater floor, those drag marks we'd seen in the photographs were now clearly visible as highways, broad pathways where heavy objects had been transported regularly across the lunar surface. The evidence was undeniable. Whatever had built these structures was still active, still expanding, still present. Landing was scheduled for 14:30 hours, though time becomes meaningless when you're 250,000 miles from home. Our target zone was a relatively flat area, approximately 2 kilometers from the main structural complex, close enough for detailed exploration, far enough to avoid landing on anything we might later regret disturbing. The lunar module's descent engine stirred up clouds of dust, unlike anything we'd encountered in training simulations. This wasn't the coarse, granular material we'd expected, but something finer, almost powder-like, that clung to our spacecraft's surfaces with unusual tenacity. When we finally touched down, a jarring impact that rattled every instrument, the dust took nearly 10 minutes to settle, obscuring our view of the surrounding terrain like a malevolent fog. As the particles finally cleared, we got our first unobstructed view of the structures. They rose from the crater floor like obsidian monuments to some incomprehensible purpose. Their surfaces absorbed our lights completely, creating voids in the darkness that seemed to pull at your vision. The architecture was alien in the most literal sense, doorways designed for beings of impossible proportions, passages that curved through dimensions that made my brain ache to contemplate, surfaces that seemed to shift and flow even when logic insisted they had to be solid rock. "Mission Control, this is Apollo 18, I radioed into the eternal silence. "We have achieved successful touchdown in Crater Ptolemaeus at 14:47, mission elapsed time. Beginning surface operations as scheduled." The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time in my career as an astronaut, I truly comprehended what it meant to be alone in the universe. David was first to complete EVA preparations, his excitement palpable despite the ominous nature of our surroundings. 60 years from now, they'll teach children about this day in school, he said, sealing his helmet and running through final equipment checks. We're about to make first contact with a non-terrestrial intelligence. God forgive us, we had no idea what kind of contact we were about to make. The lunar surface felt wrong from the moment we set foot outside the LM. The reduced gravity should have made every step light and effortless, but the peculiar dust created unexpected resistance, as if the ground itself was trying to hold us back. Our suit lights carved narrow cones through the perpetual darkness, revealing terrain that seemed to shift and rearrange itself just beyond the edges of our vision. The structures were even more unsettling up close. Walls that curved upward into the black sky, carved with a precision that exceeded anything human engineering could achieve. The surfaces radiated warmth despite the minus 250-degree environment, as if heated from within by some internal energy source. And everywhere we looked, We found evidence of recent activity, tool marks that were still sharp, excavation sites where the dust hadn't yet settled, areas where the regolith had been deliberately cleared and arranged in complex patterns. "These passages extend for miles," King observed, directing his helmet light down one of the main entrances. "I'm reading massive hollow spaces throughout the subsurface. It's like they've honeycombed the entire crater. The doorways were profoundly disturbing, too tall for human proportions, designed for beings that stood 8 or 9 feet in height, too narrow for anything with human shoulder width. And the angles were wrong in ways that created optical illusions, making it impossible to judge distances or determine where passages actually led." We spent the first hour documenting everything we could see from the surface, taking photographs and measurements that would later be classified beyond the reach of human eyes. But it was David who made the discovery that changed our mission from reconnaissance to nightmare. "I'm detecting atmospheric readings," he announced, his voice tight with scientific excitement. "There's a thin but measurable atmosphere in some of these deeper passages. Carbon dioxide, nitrogen, trace amounts of water vapor. Something down there is generating breathable air." The implications hit us like a physical blow. The structures weren't ancient ruins, they were inhabited, against every survival instinct screaming in our heads. We followed David into the main passage. The tunnel descended at a steep angle, spiraling downward like a massive drill bit boring into the moon's core. The walls were covered with intricate carvings, not quite writing, but certainly purposeful markings that suggested communication, record-keeping, perhaps even art. After descending for what felt like hours, we emerged into a cavern so vast that our combined lights couldn't penetrate its boundaries. But we could see enough. More than enough. They stood in perfect formation, like an army awaiting orders from a commander who had been silent for millennia. Row upon row of figures, each one nearly 9 feet tall, arranged with mathematical precision throughout the enormous chamber. At first glance, they appeared almost human. Upright posture, bilateral symmetry, recognizable limbs and torso. But the details were all wrong. Horribly wrong. Their limbs were too long, jointed at angles that would have shattered human bones. Their heads were elongated like eggs, with eye sockets positioned too far apart and jawlines that extended forward in predatory snouts. And their mouths were filled with rows upon rows of needle-sharp projections, clearly designed for tearing flesh rather than processing plant matter. "Are they alive?" King whispered, his voice barely audible through our comm system. For several long moments, none of us moved. The figures stood motionless, their alien heads tilted at identical angles as if listening to something beyond human perception. They appeared to be constructed from the same dark material as the surrounding architecture, seamlessly integrated into the chamber's design. Ancient, silent, waiting. Then, David, driven by the scientific curiosity that had brought us this far, approached the nearest figure for closer examination. His helmet light played across its elongated features, revealing details that would later replay in my nightmares for decades. The creature's eyes opened, not the slow flutter of awakening, but an instantaneous transition from dormancy to full alertness. 2 orbs of pale luminescence burning with their own internal fire, fixed on David with the focused intensity of a predator selecting prey. The light wasn't reflected, it originated from within, as if powered by some biological process that human science couldn't explain. For an eternal moment, David and the creature regarded each other across the vast evolutionary gulf between species. Then another pair of eyes opened, and another. Throughout the massive chamber, hundreds of glowing orbs began to activate like stars appearing in a darkening sky. The effect was hypnotic and terrifying, creating a constellation of alien intelligence in the depths of the moon. But it was the coordination that truly frightened us, each creature awakening in perfect sequence, as if responding to some unheard signal that commanded absolute obedience. We ran. 3 trained astronauts, men who had faced the dangers of space travel and the isolation of lunar exploration, fleeing through alien corridors like panicked children. Behind us came sounds that violated every law of physics, scraping, clicking, the rhythmic whisper of movement that we could somehow hear through our sealed environmental systems. The acoustics made no sense in the airless lunar environment, but terror has its own logic. We could hear them following us, their movement coordinated and purposeful. They weren't simply chasing us. They were herding us, driving us back toward the surface through specific passages, while systematically cutting off alternative escape routes. We reached the LM and sealed the hatch, our hearts hammering against our ribs like caged animals. For several minutes we sat in shocked silence, our training warring with the evidence of our own senses. The helmet camera recordings would later confirm what our minds struggled to accept. We had encountered a non-human intelligence, and it was very much alive. "We leave now," King announced, his voice steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "Whatever's down there, we're not equipped to handle it." But David was transfixed by the implications of our discovery. He spent the next several hours reviewing helmet camera footage, analysing every frame with the obsessive focus of a man who understood that history had just pivoted on its axis. "Do you comprehend what this means?" he kept repeating, his eyes bright with scientific fervour. "We've discovered proof that intelligent life exists beyond Earth. This changes everything we thought we knew about our place in the universe." Part of me wanted to share his excitement. We had indeed made the most significant discovery in human history, but another part, the part that had evolved to recognize predators, was screaming warnings that my rational mind tried desperately to ignore. I should have listened to King. Should have initiated immediate departure procedures and blasted away from that crater before the situation deteriorated further. But NASA had invested enormous resources getting us to this point. We needed samples, documentation, proof that would justify the risks we'd taken. I convinced myself we could handle one more EVA, one final reconnaissance mission, to gather the evidence we needed before returning to Earth. That decision would haunt me more than the cancer currently eating through my organs. We attempted to rest in shifts, but sleep was impossible. Every mechanical sound from the LM's life support systems seemed amplified in the thin atmosphere. Every pressure equalization valve sounded like footsteps on the hull. Around 2:30 mission time, those sounds became real. It started as gentle tapping against our outer shell, like fingernails drumming on metal. Then, scraping sounds, as if something was methodically testing the strength of our spacecraft's construction. The noises moved with deliberate purpose around the LM's perimeter, probing for weaknesses with the patience of engineers, conducting a structural analysis. David pressed his face against the small observation window and went completely rigid. The colour drained from his features until he looked like a corpse, and for several seconds he couldn't form words. "What is it?" I demanded. "Look outside," he whispered. I peered through the thick porthole glass and felt my sanity crack like thin ice. The crater floor was alive with movement. Not dozens of creatures, but hundreds, emerging from concealed passages throughout the structural complex. They moved with fluid grace in the low gravity, their glowing eyes creating a galaxy of malevolent stars in the permanent darkness. They had surrounded our landing site, but they weren't attacking. They were studying us with the methodical thoroughness of scientists examining a new specimen. Several creatures had positioned themselves near critical components of our spacecraft. The landing legs, the ascent engine, the environmental control systems. Their elongated fingers traced our technology with obvious intelligence, as if memorizing every detail for future reference. "They're reverse engineering our systems," King observed, his voice hollow with implications. "This isn't random curiosity. This is systematic intelligence gathering." The creatures worked with the coordination of a hive mind, communicating through methods we couldn't detect or understand. Some maintained strategic positions that would block our launch trajectory, while others began carefully undermining our landing legs. The LM started tilting at dangerous angles as they excavated precise amounts of soil from beneath our support struts. It became horrifyingly clear that they understood exactly what our spacecraft was and how it functioned. These weren't primitive beings reacting to an intrusion. They were advanced intelligences conducting a deliberate analysis of human technology for purposes we could only imagine. By dawn mission time, we were effectively prisoners. "I'm going out there," David announced, beginning his final suiting procedures with the grim determination of a man who understood he was probably going to die. "If I can clear the ascent engine and landing legs, you two might be able to launch." "That's suicide," I protested, though we all knew he was right. Maybe, but it's the only chance any of us have of getting home. David armed himself with every tool in our equipment manifest: geological hammers, sample containers, emergency repair implements, anything that might serve as a weapon in close combat. As he prepared to cycle through the airlock, I wanted to stop him. Should have stopped him, but our situation had become untenable, and David's sacrifice might be our only hope for survival. The creatures seemed to anticipate his emergence from the LM. As soon as David stepped onto the surface, they began moving with calculated precision, not retreating in fear, but repositioning themselves according to some predetermined strategy that spoke of intelligence and planning. They were herding him again, drawing him away from our spacecraft towards the tunnel entrances. David fought with the desperate courage of a man who knew he was going to die, but was determined to give his crewmates a chance to live. He wielded his geological hammer like a weapon of war, driving back any creature that ventured within striking distance. His radio crackled with determination and fury as he carved a path through their ranks towards the ascent engine. For several minutes it appeared he might actually succeed. Several creatures retreated from his aggressive advance, giving him the space needed to reach our critical systems. But others were moving to flank him, cutting off his retreat route back to the LM with the tactical precision of experienced predators. The end came with brutal efficiency. 3 creatures seized his arms and legs, while others swarmed over his life support backpack. Their needle-like appendages found purchase in his equipment seals, and we could hear the deadly hiss of escaping atmosphere through our radio connection. David's screams pierced the static as they dragged him towards the nearest tunnel entrance. His helmet light bounced wildly across the crater floor as he struggled, casting insane shadows that danced like demons in the darkness. Then the light disappeared into the depths and our radio link went silent, except for the eternal whisper of cosmic background radiation. "David," I shouted into the microphone, but there was no response from the alien tunnels that had swallowed our friend. King and I initiated emergency launch procedures with hostile entities still positioned around our spacecraft. The ascent engine's ignition blast vaporized several creatures, but instead of leaving identifiable remains, their bodies seemed to dissolve into the lunar dust as if they had never existed. Others clung to our landing legs until the violent acceleration tore them free and sent them tumbling back to the surface far below. The ascent was a symphony of system failures and cascading emergencies. Our fuel consumption exceeded all calculations. Life support operated at minimal efficiency, and half our navigation equipment had been compromised by the creature's investigation, but through a combination of desperate skill and impossible luck, we somehow reached the relative safety of lunar orbit. I made the mistake of looking down at Crater Ptolemaeus one final time. The entire crater system was alive with purposeful movement. Not hundreds of creatures, but thousands upon thousands, emerging from an underground network that extended far beyond what we had imagined. They moved in organized formations across the lunar surface, spreading toward other craters in coordinated waves that spoke of military precision and strategic planning. As I watched in growing horror, I realized the terrible truth that would poison every remaining day of my life. This wasn't one isolated colony of alien beings. It was a vast network of interconnected settlements, possibly covering the entire far side of the moon. They had been using our nearest celestial neighbor as a staging ground for God only knew how long, establishing bases, monitoring Earth, preparing for something that humanity wasn't ready to comprehend. Many of them looked upward as we passed overhead in our damaged spacecraft. Their glowing eyes tracked our orbital path with obvious intelligence, and I had the bone-deep certainty that they could see us as clearly as we could see them. They were studying our escape trajectory, learning our capabilities, analyzing our weaknesses for future reference. They knew we were there, they knew where we had come from, and they knew exactly how to follow us home. The return journey to Earth passed in stunned silence, broken only by essential operational communications. King and I both understood that our lives had been fundamentally altered, that we had witnessed something that challenged every assumption about humanity's place in the cosmos. When we finally splashed down in the Pacific Ocean 72 hours later, NASA recovery teams were already waiting with prepared cover stories and security protocols designed to ensure our permanent silence. The debriefing lasted 6 days in an underground facility that appeared on no government maps. Men in expensive suits asked the same questions repeatedly, recording our answers and cross-referencing them with the helmet camera footage that had somehow survived our harrowing escape. They were particularly interested in the creature's obvious intelligence, their systematic analysis of our technology, and their apparent ability to coordinate complex operations across vast distances. David Hall officially died in a catastrophic system failure during extended EVA operations. His wife received the folded flag, a Bronze Star medal, and the solemn assurance that her husband had given his life in service to his country and the advancement of human knowledge. The truth was classified at levels that made nuclear weapons secrets look like children's bedtime stories. King and I were sworn to absolute silence under threat of treason charges that would have resulted in life imprisonment or execution. We were heroes, they informed us, pioneers who had risked everything to expand the boundaries of human understanding. But we were also dangerous liabilities who could never speak publicly about what we had discovered in the depths of Crater Ptolemaeus. The Apollo program was officially terminated 8 months later, ostensibly due to budget constraints and shifting national priorities. The real reason was filed away in basement archives where it would remain buried until the end of civilization. America would never return to the moon because America now understood that the moon was already occupied by something that viewed humanity as a potential threat to be monitored and, if necessary, eliminated. King lasted 22 years before the psychological pressure became unbearable. I discovered his body in his suburban garage in March of 1995, a .38 revolver in his hand, and a handwritten note that simply read, "They're coming. God help us, they're coming." The official investigation concluded that he had committed suicide due to depression following his recent divorce, but I knew the real reason. In his final months, King had begun experiencing phenomena that suggested our lunar encounter had somehow marked us. Shadows that moved independently of their sources, scratching sounds in the walls of his house, the persistent sensation of being watched by unseen observers who never seemed to blink. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps they had begun their infiltration of Earth decades ago, and we were simply too primitive to detect their presence. I've spent 53 years monitoring astronomical data, waiting for confirmation of my worst fears. Recent discoveries have provided that confirmation in ways that terrify me, more than the cancer slowly consuming my internal organs. Lunar seismic activity in regions that should be geologically dormant. Structured radio transmissions from the moon's far side that match the breathing patterns we recorded during Apollo 18. Satellite imagery revealing new surface features in craters that haven't changed for billions of years. Last month, I received an unexpected visit from Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a radio astronomer from the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. She brought with her recordings that made my blood freeze in my veins, the same rhythmic transmissions we had detected during our mission, but amplified and more complex. The signals now contained harmonic frequencies suggesting multiple sources coordinating their communications across vast distances. We've been tracking exponential increases in activity over the past 5 years, she explained, spreading charts and spectral analyses across my kitchen table. Whatever's generating these signals is becoming more organized, more sophisticated. NASA has been monitoring the situation through classified channels, but they refuse to share their conclusions with the civilian scientific community. I wanted desperately to tell her everything, to warn her about what was waiting in those dark lunar craters, preparing for something that would reshape the balance of power in our solar system. But my security oath still binds me, even as I prepare to face my own mortality. Instead, I offered her advice that probably saved her career and possibly her life. Stop investigating, stop listening. There are discoveries that humanity isn't prepared to make. She left that day convinced that I was simply another paranoid veteran, haunted by classified operations from the Cold War era. I pray she never learns how terrifyingly wrong she was. The truth is that we didn't abandon lunar exploration because of budget cuts or waning public interest. We stopped going to the moon because we discovered that we weren't welcome there, because our nearest celestial neighbour had been claimed by an intelligence that viewed Earth not as a curiosity to be studied, but as a resource to be eventually harvested. Those creatures have been using the moon as a forward observation post for decades, possibly centuries. They have monitored our radio transmissions, learned our languages, studied our military capabilities, analysed our social structures. They understand our strengths and weaknesses better than we understand them ourselves. And now, if the recent astronomical evidence is accurate, they have decided that humanity has developed to the point where we represent either a useful asset or a potential threat. I've performed the calculations based on the reproductive rates I observed during our brief encounter. If they have been multiplying steadily for 50 years, there could be millions of them by now. Millions of highly intelligent predators with technology that makes our greatest achievements look like primitive tools. They've had half a century to prepare, to plan, to decide exactly how they want to manage the inconvenient human presence on the third planet from the sun. The signs are becoming impossible to ignore for anyone with the knowledge and clearance to recognize them. Increased funding for planetary defense initiatives that are never discussed publicly. Military space programs operating under classifications that exceed even our most sensitive nuclear projects. Government astronomers quietly reassigned to monitoring duties they're forbidden to discuss with their families. Something is coming. Something that has been planning this moment longer than human civilization has existed. And when they finally decide to reveal themselves, we will discover that every science fiction scenario we've ever imagined was woefully inadequate preparation for the reality of contact with a species that views us as we view livestock. I'm recording this final testimony because the truth deserves to be preserved, even if it arrives too late to matter, even if nobody will believe it until the lights begin appearing in our night sky, and it becomes obvious that we were never alone in our cosmic neighborhood. The cancer will claim me long before I witness the final act of this drama, but future generations deserve to understand why we really abandoned lunar exploration. They deserve to know what has been watching them from the shadows of our nearest celestial companion, analysing our development, waiting for the optimal moment to make their presence undeniably known. The moon hangs outside my bedroom window tonight, its familiar face turned toward Earth as it has been for millions of years. But I know what exists on the dark side now. I know what has been building and planning and preparing in those ancient impact craters. When the time finally comes, and I believe that time is approaching rapidly, humanity will understand why we never returned to the moon. We will understand that we were never meant to leave Earth in the first place. This is John Miller, Apollo 18, Command Module Pilot, making my final log entry. The truth needed to be told, even if it comes too late to prevent what's coming. Even if nobody will listen until our visitors decide that the time for secrecy is ended. May God forgive us for what we found up there. May God help us when they finally come home. The recording ends here. The truth dies with me, unless they've already begun their final approach.